So we can start anywhere. We can start with society or with biology itself. You were talking before about all the different, we were talking about religion actually, but all the different mechanisms to galvanize large groups of people. What's the best way to do it for biology now?
Well, here's the thing. We can inform to some extent, but science can paint pictures of the future, but we need a lot more data than we have right now. So there's some interesting hypotheses that, yes, music and religion may have evolved in order to promote cooperation between people. And the issue is, of course, evolution is amoral. The reason why that was hypothesized to be necessary by Peter Turchin, who studies cultural evolution at the University of Connecticut, he says that it was war. That is, competition between groups of humans necessitated fielding larger armies. And that meant that people needed to have enough in common in order to ally, and those that were able to do that had an advantage. And that music and religion were at different stages key to this.
Which stage was which? No.
Music probably very early on.
Yeah.
I mean, ritual, and I would say music is the purest expression of the human ability to connect with others and to have a shared purpose.
Right. As with religion, music also has that fight. We sort of take it for granted that music is one of the best ways to have people commune and experience something together, but it's also an incredible way to exclude people. I mean, we often use music to define our group or define, our generation, or define, or put on our headphones and completely get lost in the music.
It's true, although I would blame technology for that last one. I mean, before that, music was inherently consensual. You could really only have one piece of music being performed in one space in a group of people at a time until we invented that particular technology, thereby atomizing ourselves that much more. So how do we get beyond that?
Right.
How do we incentivize people to come together to listen to music again?
Yeah, and one way, kind of a subversive way with these symphonies, is that, well, it's like being a teacher or being a parent. We both have two kids. Your kids are a little young. His kids are that big. My kids are that big. But I don't know. Your son is your older child is 2.5. So I don't know how much pedagogy you've tried. But what I was going to say is, I always found that a not very good technique is to give somebody an answer and to say, I mean, sometimes you have to. You have to say that's dangerous, that's not good. This is what I think, and this is what you have to do. But mostly, it's a lot more fun to say, that's a great question. Let's think about it. Let's figure that out together. And so if you have a proposal to say, well, music, we all like music. We all probably like different kinds of music, but let's make something together. And let's figure out what it means to make something where it feels like everybody's, and it also feels like mine and yours. I think that's why I kind of came to that kind of pedagogical technique. Or creative technique. It's subversive, but then people don't know what it is ahead of time.
It works best in the lab too. But I found your comment Marvin's comment about how music compelled us to fill in the story ourselves. That it provided the framework that then could be detailed, possibly through other art forms, but necessarily by, and especially in your work, by the people involved.
Yeah. I want to ask you a real music and biology question, both kind of technically and then ethically. One reason that we build things like hyper instruments is to allow somebody with a great deal of skill to leverage that skill even further. So, if you're Yo-Yo Ma, you can do exactly what you want to on the cello. You can play, and it's beautiful and interesting if with that particular articulation, the normal sound comes out, but other layers and other textures. So you could imagine for a performer, but let's talk about a listener for a minute. I mean, you could imagine engineering either a prosthetic or engineering your auditory system, let's say. And you could imagine it different ways. I mean, my wife's here. Her father had an accident a few years ago and lost a lot of his hearing. And we've been looking around for years. Hearing aids are awful. So you could imagine just a much more sophisticated way of restoring somebody's hearing, of supplementing hearing, of enhancing hearing. I mean, you could imagine, hearing an incredibly beautiful, soft sound way over there with great presence over here. So, I don't know, when you think about enhancing our senses or enhancing our perception or our ability to be in the midst of something, what do you think is possible and what do you think is a good idea?
Well,
and what can we do this week?
We're clearly verging on the transhumanism box, but in terms of human augmentation versus medical intervention, then yes, you could do far better with technology in terms of information and signal processing. I mean, I've always been frustrated at parties or even in restaurants where you go there to talk with people, and yet the ambient noise level is so loud that you end up shouting, and you still end up missing things. Wouldn't it be nice if you had an earbud that could filter out all that unwanted noise and let you focus specifically on what a particular person was saying?
We were at a meal like that yesterday in a restaurant. The other alternative would be to have something that would just shut everyone up. That would be a good one too. And kind of a dampening on everyone in the room.
Positive enhancement, Todd. Positive.
Yes, okay.
But yeah, that gets into the question, of course, of to what extent should we enhance people who are already gifted versus devoting our efforts to improving the lives of those who suffered an unlucky toss of the dice.
Yeah.
And that's one of those fundamental ethical questions that we can really only answer by doing.
But I think it's a huge question for everything we deal with now, and posed that way, I think we'd probably all. I certainly agree with you that kind of designer enhancements for people who are already very fortunate is really not a great way to spend our time.
And of course, this becomes particularly fraught when you apply to biology and children and the future generations, because, well, if you imagine 7 generations ago, how much our powers to manipulate the world have increased. And yet in all that time, we have never been able to affect ourselves. And now we can. Yeah. So what is it going to be like 7 generations hence? Are we going to be recognizably human anymore? Are we going to be beyond human? Madison once said that if men were angels, there would be no need for government. And if men were governed by angels, there would be no dissent.
And what if government was like it is now? What then?
I'm pretty sure there's no angels involved.
Yeah. So how does that whole discussion figure into kind of a new way to monitor science and decision? It's maybe the most. Well, I mean, we don't want to destroy things, but kind of ethically, where the interventions are made and who gets access to all of this. What do we do?
Honestly, I feel that that's a less pressing problem than this, because gene drive is something that, again, one person can decide the outcome for many. Whereas, to some extent, I mean, to quote another founder, Jefferson said, it neither picks my pocket nor breaks my back. Well, the same is to some extent true of if a few people decide to enhance their children or give them unfair advantages, augmenting those that random luck has already given them. Once everyone starts doing that, once it starts becoming a major disadvantage in society, then that is a major problem. Because we already have issues with social mobility and opportunity everywhere in the world, across all human societies. And we certainly don't want to make that worse. But to what extent can we use different pressures within and without an out-group? I mean, sadly, the best way to unify people in one group is to present them with an external threat.
Yeah.
So if we wanted to, for example, ensure that everyone within our country had equal access to this, if you wanted to actually shock our government into ensuring equal access for everyone, one of the best ways to do it would be to point out that, look, this is a national security imperative. Any country that does not do this is going to be at a tremendous economic and intellectual disadvantage versus any country that does do it.
Yep.
Well, that's great, but now you've just moved that inequality between countries, even if you may have addressed the problem within. And then, of course, everyone is forced into it, which is the other problem with technology. It's an arms race. Does music have that problem?
Well, it's actually, it would be nice to open to questions, but I have one more question for you, actually, which is a kind of music biology one in a bit of a different direction. Be very curious to know what you think. The first class of this this particular class I'm giving right now in January, there have been some actually surprising number of really major cultural figures and musical figures who passed away in the last few months. So Marvin Minsky was great in many ways, but in music, George Martin, who probably had more to do with the Beatles and what they became than most people think, died just a few weeks ago. In early January, David Bowie died, and right before David Bowie died, Pierre Boulez died. And the question I want to ask you is about Pierre Boulez and David Bowie, like this. So how many people know who David Bowie was? With this audience, I don't know. You knew the sheep, and you didn't. Okay, so there's David Bowie and Pierre Boulez. I won't ask you to raise your. Okay, 2, 3, yeah. So Pierre Boulez was probably one of the 2 or 3 great classical music composers and conductors in the 20th century into the 21st century. And David Bowie, of course, was one of the most radical innovators in pop music. The big difference between them, and that's the question I want to ask, is through his whole career, David Bowie was always very innovative, but he always stayed within the kind of musical framework of what you would call kind of the language of music that people expect and grow up with. And so the question I'm going to ask is whether that's like a biological constraint or not. So David Bowie used chords we were familiar with and melodies and kind of a structure and the amount of change that people are quite familiar with. Boulez came to age right after World War II, when most people, especially in Europe but also in the States, looked at what had happened and said, okay, we kind of messed up the world in World War I. Now in World War II, we killed off European culture. It's gone, and we just have to invent a new one. And it showed in every place. But Boulez was one of the more radical people who said, that means that the music we make now can't be based on any principle that traditional music was based on. So it can't use any chords that have a reference to the past. It can't use, not only can it use a melody that we recognize, but it can't even think of melody. Like melody's kind of like a figure having a face in a painting. So the notes can't be recognizable that way. The rhythms can't be repetitive. So instead, we have to break that down. So and on and on and on. And it's music that was radical, incredibly fresh, and difficult to listen to. And ever since, I happen to love it, and I love Boulez's music, but ever since then, ever since the 40s and 50s, there's been an argument about whether there are biological and cognitive constraints for what we can listen to, what we can enjoy, what has meaning. And the jury's still out. It was out in our first class when we listened to Boulez and we listened to Bowie. And some people like some and some others, but you can still listen to the Boulez and say, will this ever be something that I can memorize? Will it be something that when I hear it, I have that sense of reinterpretation, but also having lived with it? I happen to think the answer is yes, but there are many disagreements. What are your thoughts about, part of it's cultural, but literally biologically and cognitively, the way we're constructed?
It's a beautiful microcosm of everything about human culture,
Yep.
which is it all has to run on this machinery, and that does impose some constraints that shapes the fitness landscape, which is how we think of it in evolution. Imagine that all possible variants of whatever DNA strand, protein, or idea, as Richard Dawkins put it, meme, is some point within a two-dimensional landscape, and each one of those has an associated fitness in the relevant environment, and populations then climb the mountains in the fitness landscape to reach a local peak.
Yep.
And Bowie sounds like he moved along the ridges from one peak to another in a connected mountain range, whereas Boulez essentially struck out in the middle of nowhere and hoped to find a peak, trying a bunch of different things, crossing that fitness valley. Now that's something that natural evolution really struggles to do, to generate that sort of great leap. And that's an area where rational design is superior.
Yeah.
Although really, arguably, rational design is just another form of evolution because, of course, you're still doing modeling in your thoughts. You're just operating on a different, transitioning the problem to a different fitness landscape. But I'm getting very esoteric in evolution. So I guess the answer is...
He likes Bowie better. No, it's
Bowie is more likely to work. That is, if you can, one of the neat things about evolution, where the landscape metaphor fails, is that the fitness landscape is affected by where everybody else is on it. That is, most evolutionary pressure is due to other members, competing members of your own species. Similarly, with ideas in culture, it's competing ideas, especially in the same ecological niche. So what Bowie was doing was, in pushing the boundaries but within what was acceptable, he was trying to change tastes and push people's notions of what was acceptable further and further out by always dancing on that edge. Whereas Boulez was trying to find something that had never previously been discovered, but that nevertheless was compatible and could potentially be a higher peak.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and we've been looking at microbiomes, which I knew nothing about 6 months ago, and sure it's not true, but there's something interesting about how many of them there are, how many bacteria there are, and how volatile they are compared to our, let's say, our brain cells. And the thought that, I don't know, maybe Boulez can push our microbiome around more than he could push our cognitive constraints around. But maybe on that thought, it'd be interesting to have time for a few questions for sure.
We have microphones coming down. Shelby, do you have that side?
Thank you. I was thinking that a common solution you both are reaching for, you might call open source music. And open source is a way of evading people being secretive and making something really bad on their own, although I don't know whether that's preventable if it's operating at an individual level. But the other part of it is, the other danger, of course, is the other value of open source, I would presume, is to preempt patenting. And the danger is that capital will kind of take gene driving, a kind of Google gene drive, if you will, and do even more horrendous things than individuals might be able to do. What do you think about that, and how might you prevent it?
It's a great point. And yes, open source software is in many ways our guide for what we want this to become. And as for capital, global drive systems are interesting in that they're not very amenable to a business plan. Here, let me permanently solve the problem everywhere in the world all at once. You want to give me a recurring revenue stream for that? That said, yes, I would very much prefer to keep it nonprofit as long as possible, certainly on the global drive systems, because there's a company called Oxitec that releases sterile male mosquitoes in order to drive down the populations that spread dengue and chikungunya and Zika. And obviously this has enjoyed a bit of publicity lately thanks to the Zika issue. But when they did town halls in the Florida Keys, well, people said, look, okay, you want us to give our approval for you to release these in our environment, but you're a for-profit company, and therefore you exist to make money, and you make money if we say yes, therefore we can't believe anything you say, go away. If you want to actually use the technology for good, you probably don't want that response. You want a balanced assessment, which means nonprofit all the way. And that raises an interesting question. Should IP be used to keep things nonprofit? Because also, it's a self-propagating technology. You don't need large amounts of capital to develop it. That's part of why it is so threatening, is that an individual can do it without that many resources. So we don't need capital for that, and I would love to keep capital out of it for that reason. Great point.
And let me just make one comment. I think about it a little bit differently, although if you think about the capital involved with an artist like Lady Gaga making a song and selling that, it is relevant. I think in the arts, I think the question is a little bit different, which is, I mean, I think what's broken down is the kind of extremely rich ecology, a kind of cultural ecology between everybody in a society that participate in enjoying and making cultural artifacts. 300 years ago, 200 years ago, a new piece came out and everybody had a piano at home. And most educated people, most people had a piano. And you didn't go to a concert. You'd sit down and play a piano and sing around the piano. And most people went to some kind of church or synagogue and sang in a congregation, and then if Beethoven came out with his piece, well, you might play that at your piano also, and you realize Beethoven was better than so and so, but it wasn't like there was one Beethoven and then nobody else and everybody else was a consumer, which is kind of what we have now. We have in all the arts and actually a lot of intellectual domain, we have a cult of celebrity, and it's that gets reinforced by social media, and then everybody else is a fan, and it's terrible for the culture. And so it's pretty radical to say in music that you want to make something that's fantastic, but you want everybody in the food chain, somebody just starting out and somebody with a lot of experience and somebody who just enjoys and maybe somebody who doesn't like music, somehow has a role in making this happen. And I'd like to see it be something natural that develops, but I think right now we have to do something radical to make that happen. And if you look at it financially, I mean, Lady Gaga is actually really, she's a smart, creative person, but there is no financial model where she could really do that and make her song, and what would that mean? And plus, she doesn't have the time. But we have to find a way to. It's interesting. More and more music conservatories. I went to Juilliard. The most. I don't know if it's the most conservative, but it's certainly the most establishment music conservatory. And conservatories are called that for a reason. They're really conservative. They have a model for teaching and a model. But every day now I get a call from some conservatory that, like Curtis in Philadelphia, is calling me every day saying, we can't do business like this anymore. We can't train our people just to be professional performers with no contact with, they can't just get up on stage and think that's what a life in music is. So the whole model has to really break down, and what that becomes financially is
similar to what Kevin was saying, that the model is not working, it's broken.
Yeah, it's more dangerous when his model breaks.
Yeah.
But we can make some pretty bad music if the model's not good.
I'll do this without the mic.
I want to know what your kids thought of this.
Actually, it might be better with the mic so people can hear you.
I want to respond to what Todd said about open source. So in some sense, it's inherently open source because the gene drive, once it's out there, you can read it, right? But
I'm sorry,
I think
what's out there?
The gene drive, because once it goes out there, it goes everywhere, right? But to say that there's no profit model doesn't seem to be right. Imagine combating gene drives where you have to keep buying something to defend yourself against opposing gene drives. So I would say that there's a larger question here that of the three disciplines you mentioned, science, religion, and arts, we know all three are double-edged swords. And they will remain so that even cooperation, human cooperation, is not something a pure good, because herd behavior. So please address, if you can, this inevitably double-edged nature of all of these disciplines. So give us a balanced rather than
A dichotomy.
so optimistic message.
I did.
I'm very optimistic about my ability to spread pessimism, which seems to be in dire.
Well, so I don't want to answer too long, but we can talk about it for a long time. But I would just say that I think one model in the arts to think about, music's a very good example. Traditionally we have a model of people who, let's say there are three fundamental roles in music. There are more than that, but let's say there are three. One is the creator, the person who kind of hypothetically imagines some work. And music's interesting because if you make a work that is meant to be played by people rather than something in a studio, the work doesn't fully exist until you have the second category, which are performers, people who realize that. And then you have listeners, people who are maybe not professionals. They haven't created the content. They haven't modified the content. They're there to receive it. And I think the interesting way to think about music, it's very clear, and I think it refers to all the arts. I think these roles need to blend, and they don't need to blend in just one way. But I think that the interesting area now is an area where when you compose something, maybe you don't compose it all alone, or if you compose it and put it out in the world, maybe it's not fully finished when it's put out in the world. It's put out as a proposition that is there for other people to adapt or to finish or to make their version of. And I think it's something technology makes very possible, but I think it's something culturally that we need. Maybe we need it just for a stage so that people get actively involved again. So I don't know. That's a triple-edged sword that meets in the middle somewhere, perhaps. Do you want to?
I don't like being too negative in public. It tends to scare people. That said, yes, you're right. There are certain applications wherein, say a big corporation, which I will not name, that specializes in agriculture, decides that they want to reverse herbicide resistance, which is a major problem that they're facing. And of course, you spread a drive system to do that, which could do that in some plants, or at least in the weeds that you care about. But then you're spraying herbicide all the time, so you're constantly selecting against your drive. So the drive wars against the natural selection for intact herbicide resistance. And that means you would need to overwrite your drive over and over again. So you would need 3 versions. A overwrites B, overwrites C, overwrites A. And you just release them in a cycle. And in that sense, you might need to buy new, in this case, seeds of the weed rather than your crop in order to do that. So yeah, there are some cases in business models, including by those companies that people probably least want to use this technology. And I've been talking solely about global drive. One of the other areas we're looking at is ways of making local drive systems, in large part because it's easier for people to cooperate and make decisions at the local level than the global level. If you wanted to get rid of, say, dengue, well, there's 2 species of Aedes mosquitoes that spread dengue, chikungunya, Zika, yellow fever, and a bunch of other things. They are basically flying syringes. They're invasive over most of the world, but those species live in areas in which more than half the world's population lives. What does informed consent mean when you need to get more than half the world to agree on something? All those countries. That's a very, very hard problem. So whereas in contrast, if we had a way that we could do it just in one area, just ideally city by city or even at smaller scale, then that would make using this technology easier, and it wouldn't cause the risk of conflict, because I can imagine international tensions being ratcheted up if one country decides to knowingly mess with its ecosystem, even though those effects are going to spill over into other countries, because those mosquitoes are native to Asia. Yeah, our ecosystems would be better off if we released a gene drive to drive them extinct, but that doesn't mean theirs would, and it would spread. So there's your downside.
Well, in some sense,
Well,
it's already out of the box.
Yeah, why don't we take that outside? Maybe one more question, and then we can.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the conservatory model.
With,
Charlotte Mormon,
with or without mosquitoes? No. That's,
though Charlotte Mormon never said she really liked.
could you talk into the microphone?
Oh, Charlotte Mormon was at Juilliard, and she more or less created the Fluxus art events in New York City in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s. And her favorite piece of music to perform was a John Cage piece, which she somehow brought to hundreds of thousands of people. So that's, I think, a model that way pre-exists what we're all talking about here, that this woman did essentially all by herself from almost nothing. So the model's there. We just have to move with it.
So just say a little more about Charlotte Mormon was amazing. She was a cellist who played
Right. Well,
a lot of
she's much known for playing without clothes on.
I know,
She's
yeah.
also known for being
Not at Juilliard,
wafted
though.
into the air on helium balloons and so on and so forth. But the thing she started in New York City is what we call happenings. She created this thing called the festival, the International Festival for the Arts in New York in the Lindsay administration, essentially on no money, and spread it, and it turned into what we have now, like music in the park, in Central Park, and so on and so forth. But she did it on her own, and then, quote, open source model, quite a long time ago. But we wouldn't even be having this conversation without the stuff that Charlotte started in those days.
Hear, hear. So
That's all.
you should all go watch video of Charlotte Mormon playing Namjoon Pike and John Cage. You're absolutely right. And there are many, many people like that, thank God.
So we're a little bit over time. We will continue having more informal conversations in the lobby. I want to thank Kevin and Todd for marvelous conversation and presentation. Really,